Disaster strikes a state-of-the-art bridge in Miami.
This was a brand new construction project. How could this happen?
A bold new skyscraper in danger of collapse in downtown Boston.
The building itself would actually collapse by blowing over.
In Alabama, a radical railroad crossing with a deadly design flaw.
I knew it was going to be a really, really bad situation. There was no escape.
And a Spanish energy project that shocked everyone.
The gas goes into the fault moves, and then you have your earthquake.
With big builds, even the smallest mistake can be a huge disaster. From miscalculations to misunderstandings. Some with deadly consequences. These catastrophes are every engineer's worst nightmare. In the mission to create more audacious builds, design can sometimes dictate the engineering. But the safety and strength of any new structure should always take precedence over style. Like this bridge in Florida, and one of the worst construction catastrophes in recent history.
No one who was here could believe that it had actually happened.
A landmark project with a fatal flaw.
This bridge was meant to be a masterclass in design, but it was hit by a catalogue of errors.
It would stay as a day that we will remember always.
Miami, Florida, known for its great beaches and stunning architecture, is also a major university town.
With more than 50,000 students, Florida International University is the largest in South Florida, and it has a world-renowned engineering research facility.
With student numbers growing, FIU recruited private developers to build high-rise housing within walking distance of campus. The only problem was that walk included crossing a busy 8-lane highway. Investigative reporter Nicholas Nahamas explains that just making it to class could be dangerous.
We're now driving down Southwest 8th Street, a really busy commuter road. Crossing it can be something like the old game of Frogger. So for students who tended to live on the Sweetwater sides, for them to get to class, they had to cross this extremely busy road. Students would sometimes dart across. One girl was killed and several other students have been injured. So there was a real need for a pedestrian bridge that would connect the living area and the classroom area.
The solution seemed simple. Build a pedestrian bridge spanning the roadway.
The university didn't just want this to be a functional project. The ambition was a landmark design that both the university and the students could be proud of.
Work on the $120 million signature bridge began in March 2016. The design would be a pioneering interpretation of a traditional truss bridge, but with the revolutionary look of a dramatic cable-stayed crossing. The asymmetric design further complicated the geometry of the bridge, as engineer David Beck explains.
The layout of a normal truss system is, it'd be equal, it'd be symmetrical, but however, since this was made to look like a cable-stayed bridge, with the pylon coming up to here, with cables coming into it, that the location of these diagonals is to match the cables coming down from the pylon.
But that wasn't the end of the engineers' bold plans. The 53-meter-long main span would be assembled using a revolutionary technique called accelerated bridge construction, or ABC for short.
One principle of ABC is to avoid disrupting traffic during construction. So step one is to build as much as possible beside the freeway while the road remains open.
With a major 8-lane highway to cross, the appeal of the ABC method was obvious.
Bridge spans are prefabricated on the side of the road. Then traffic is stopped for just a matter of hours as the bridge is moved and lifted into place.
The engineering department actually has a center for accelerated bridge construction. However, the ABC Center and engineering department were not involved in the construction or the design of the FIU bridge.
On Saturday, March the 10th, 2018, as night fell, the road was closed, while the pre-constructed main span of the FIU Sweetwater University City Bridge was lifted from the roadside and lowered into its permanent home over the highway.
The bridge was actually constructed in this empty lot over here, and then in one night raised into place here.
The next evening, the road was reopened to traffic, but with 6 months of construction still to go, unresolved existing issues were beginning to cause concern.
More than a month before, the cracks had already been discovered in the bridge at its north end. The cracks were hairline, but they gradually became bigger and bigger until after the bridge was raised, cracks are really gaping 4 inches deep. It's very alarming.
Workers on the bridge, including senior management, raised concerns about the cracks.
In the days that followed, photographs were taken of the raised span. It appeared that the cracks were getting bigger.
2 structural engineers had been inspecting the bridge, and they believed that the cracks looked much worse in real life than in the photos.
While acknowledging that they did not know why the cracks were occurring or getting bigger, engineers determined that the cracks didn't present any serious safety concerns. 5 days after the span was lifted into place, at approximately 12:45 p.m. on Thursday, March 15th, disaster was caught on a truck dash cam. The entire 860-ton construction collapsed. Nearby restaurant owner Leonette Sardo heard the crash.
We were working at the restaurant that day, and we heard a very loud noise. As I looked over, I see that the bridge had already fallen down. When we get there, you see that gigantic bridge on top of cars. All of the alarms on the cars are going off like crazy, and we were just trying to see what we could do. The scene was completely memorable in a very bad way.
Student Aura Martinez was also devastated by the aftermath.
I was just about to order when all of a sudden the bridge collapsed. And I was very shocked. I didn't believe it. I just wanted to go and see what I could do. I jumped the border, I ran to the bridge, and the cars were stuck underneath, and there was nothing we could do.
The collapse cost the lives of 5 motorists and 1 construction worker. But why did this pioneering project, designed to safeguard lives and prevent accidents, go so badly wrong?
When we knew that the bridge was going to be built, we were so excited. It was just an enormous project that everybody was looking forward to. For it to become a tragedy instead of hope really affected us.
This was a brand new construction project in the United States of America, you know, one of the most industrialized nations in the world. How could this happen? How could a brand new bridge fall down on people who were just driving on their way to work or school?
The pedestrian bridge, designed to make life safer for Florida International University students, had tragically collapsed. The official report into the disaster highlighted a design flaw in the innovative structure.
One of the problems was that the signature design, essentially mimicking a cable-stayed bridge, dictated the angles of the support struts.
To create the illusion of a cable-stayed bridge, the diagonal supports on the truss had to line up perfectly with the cables. But this uneven zigzag pattern created a weakness at a key connection. Engineer David Beck explains.
When this structure was fabricated on the side of the road, It was picked up by transport, rotated 90 degrees, moved down the road, and then set on the pier. That night, a worker identified that there was major cracking down here at the bottom of member number 11 that evidently created a weak spot. Those cracks were reported to the engineer. They were coming back, and someone had given the orders to retension those rocks.
The idea was that tightening steel rods in the concrete would close up the cracks. But this step was not included in the design, and some believe it may have compromised the integrity of the entire structure. Investigative reporter Nicholas Nahamas covered the story.
The project's engineers thought that by tightening the rods, the cracks would close up. In fact, what they delivered was the fatal blow to an already failing bridge. By putting so much pressure on a piece of the bridge that was already under stress and cracking, they snapped it. So it's really the smoking gun, we believe, brought it crashing down.
When this area down in here exploded, the whole bridge collapsed within a second.
It seems the signature design compromised its integrity. And some believe other errors contributed to the scale of the tragedy, including the road remaining open during an unplanned phase of construction work.
You really have to take a look at it as two accidents. One is the construction accident, and the second one is the traffic accident. If the traffic under 8 lanes of the bridge were shut down, you would have only had a construction accident. The fact that they didn't close down doing this critical construction work with live traffic under it, you ended up with catastrophic failure.
The idea of the bridge was to improve the infrastructure of the campus. Instead, it left a lasting mark on its memory.
The tragedy has left a lot of people in Miami both extremely angry and bewildered. So the university went from having this big signature bridge project to a deadly disaster and tragedy on its hands, and it still needs to build a new structure across this space in order to get students across.
This marked all of us, and it would stay as a day that we will remember always.
Sometimes in engineering, what you build on top of is just as important as the materials you use. Getting them both wrong is a recipe for disaster. In Massachusetts, an award-winning design threatened to become a deadly disaster.
Huge sheets of glass falling from over 200 meters.
A skyscraper in real danger of crashing down in the middle of downtown Boston.
The tower could potentially topple into Copley Square in the Back Bay below it.
Bordering the Charles River, Boston, founded in 1630, is one of the most historic cities in the US. Boston has always had the ability to adapt and think on its feet, as local journalist Tim Logan explains.
Boston is one of the oldest and most historical cities in the United States. It's home to many great universities. It's a thriving urban metropolis. It wasn't always this way. Back in the 60s, Boston was fairly depressed. Its factories were closing. The ports that had fueled the city's economy were fading away. But what we had was big insurance companies. Prudential Insurance Company and the John Hancock Insurance Company.
These insurance giants decided to breathe new life into the city, building big and building bold. None would stand out on the skyline more than the new John Hancock Tower.
There hadn't been a skyscraper built in Boston since the turn of the century. They were changing the skyline. John Hancock decided to put their tower on this site behind me, on one of the most historic and most architecturally significant corners in Boston. And they had to come up with a design that respected all of this history, both sort of culturally and architecturally.
With limited space beside an already packed square, the architect designed a minimalist and modern glass building, 62 stories tall, that would be striking without overshadowing any of the historic buildings around it. Using more than 10,000 1.2 by 3.4 meter highly reflective glass panels with a subtle blue tint, the idea was that the tower would only have a slight contrast with the sky on a clear day.
It's actually a very subtle building in its way, but it also led to some of the design challenges that ultimately became something of a problem in the construction of the Hancock Tower.
Construction began in 1968, but as early as the excavation stage for the tower's foundation, the project hit its first major snag.
They had to dig out millions of feet of dirt all the way down to bedrock. I believe it's 140 feet down. And this part of Boston was largely marshlands that were filled in the 1800s.
Much of present-day Boston now sits on reclaimed land. As the city expanded, large tidal flats were filled with mud, sand, and gravel to create new land for development. Like one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, Back Bay, home of the Hancock Tower.
Originally, in the 1600s, the city of Boston covered just 800 acres. That's smaller than Central Park. Today, it's over 7 times that, with around 5,000 acres of man-made land. That's more than any other American city.
Years later, when excavation started for the foundations of the Hancock Tower, temporary steel walls were erected around the construction site to hold back the soft mixture of reclaimed land. But the walls weren't strong enough and bent inwards under pressure from the surrounding land which they were supposed to be holding back.
This inward bend of the retaining walls damaged utility lines, the sidewalk, and nearby historic buildings, including the 150-year-old Trinity Church.
There was a lawsuit, and that led to some delays in construction even before the building started coming up out of the ground.
If that wasn't enough, it was when they started going vertical that they began to encounter even more problems.
The Hancock Tower was slated to open in 1971, but engineers were facing a growing list of issues caused by the unusually long and narrow construction site. To fit within it, what would become New England's tallest tower was designed as a thin rectangle with a total height approaching 240 meters. The layout made it vulnerable to the elements. Structural engineer Stephen Ressler explains.
There were fundamental problems associated with the performance of the John Hancock Tower. The building was relatively long in one direction and relatively narrow in the other direction as a consequence of constraints of the site. Because of that geometry, and because it was a relatively lightweight steel frame, it turned out to be highly susceptible to wind-induced sway. It also proved to be particularly susceptible to twisting or torsion as a result of its unique shape.
And this twisting began to reveal a major construction problem for the tower's feature design element, the more than 10,000 glass panels, each weighing more than 200 kilograms.
Every one of these rectangular panels was essentially completely filled in with glass. The windows used were double glazed, housed in a set of metal frames with 2 glass panels. The inner face of the outermost pane of glass had a metallic coating. Unfortunately, that metallic coating proved to be the undoing of this window mounting system.
To keep sunlight out and give the tower its trademark mirror look, the glass panes were treated with a layer of chromium. This was joined to the frames with rigid lead solder. As the panes moved from the building's swaying or changes in temperature, these rigid joints cracked the glass. In turn, the panes risked detaching from the building and falling to the ground below.
Huge bits of glass that were 1 meter by 3 meters were literally popping off the building and crashing to the sidewalk hundreds of feet below.
In fact, it got so bad that police had to close off the surrounding streets whenever winds reached 45 miles per hour, or around 70 kilometers an hour.
With public safety a top priority, in October 1973, the decision was made to replace all 10,000 plus windows with panes that were more flexible, at a total cost of around 40 million in today's dollars.
During the many months it took to repair the tower, sheets of plywood replaced many of the missing glass panels, earning it the nickname the Plywood Palace.
The John Hancock Tower finally opened in 1976, 5 years behind schedule and around $100 million over budget. But that wasn't the end of the problems.
So once the building opened and people started to move in, there was a new complaint, motion sickness. People on the top floors started to feel a lot of swaying in the wind and nausea.
Forensic engineer Elizabeth Mulch explains.
Every building moves, even heavy buildings move, but you don't feel that movement until the buildings get tall. Steel buildings are particularly susceptible to the kind of movement that people can feel.
The radical solution was to install a pair of 300-ton weights on the 58th floor, known as tuned mass dampers, to stabilize the building.
A tuned mass damper is a lot like a kid's feet when they're on a swing, and when they're pushing their feet forward in time with the swing, then they go faster. If they're out of phase with the movement of the swing, they can make it stop. So it's not dangerous if a steel building's moving with the wind. And again, every building moves. But tuned mass dampers are a way to mitigate the amount of movement so that everyone feels comfortable over the height of the building.
With its long, thin footprint, the Hancock Tower needed not one, but 2 dampers.
The reason there are 2 weights instead of 1 is so that they can tug in opposite directions when the building sways or twists in the wind. The effect is very much like that of a gyroscope stabilizing the tower.
But the tower's engineering trials were about to get even more serious.
Engineers discovered another totally unexpected problem that had the potential to bring the whole tower crashing to the ground.
Even with the mass dampers in place, under a certain kind of wind loading, it was discovered that the entire tower could actually fall over.
The most serious issue with this building turned out to be a significant structural deficiency. A very prominent structural engineer discovered, with the wind striking the narrow face of the building, that the building itself would actually collapse in this mode by blowing over in response to the wind.
The thin rectangular structure was assessed as being much more unstable on its narrow sides. To prevent any potential catastrophe, the solution was to strengthen it with 1,500 tons of internal steel bracing.
This solution is really fairly straightforward from a structural engineering perspective. But from an economic perspective, it would have been extraordinarily difficult and expensive because it involved adding a lot of structure to a building after it had already been put together.
Despite all its problems, the John Hancock Tower still has a special place in the hearts of Bostonians.
For all the troubles that befell it during construction and in the first few years after it opened, the huge cost overrun, the Hancock Tower stands out distinctive on the city's skyline. It's on every postcard. And it's one of the most beloved buildings in the city. It probably will be for a long time.
The Hancock Tower was and still is an innovative and bold building, and as improbable as it may sound, actually won a prestigious National Architectural Award in 1977.
Some engineering errors can lie undetected for decades. And it only takes one mistake to turn an engineering oversight into tragedy. Like this remote railroad catastrophe in Alabama, which had disastrous consequences.
When we got there, it was a horrific sight. One car hanging off the edge of the bridge, multiple cars in the water, no escape.
An engineering oversight only uncovered by a string of tragic events.
There was no warning. No one knew this train was hurtling towards disaster.
One of the worst rail accidents in US history, which led to an urgent review of national regulations. On the Gulf Coast in the southern US, with a population of over 200,000, lies Mobile, Alabama, where the Mobile River slices the state in two. Local journalist David Rayner explains why this area conjures up the true essence of the South.
We really pride ourselves in having a beautiful downtown, situated right on Mobile Bay. Mobile has one of the largest ports on the Gulf of Mexico. One of the great things about the Delta is the wildlife. It's alligators, snakes, and you gotta be careful when you're in the water.
South Alabama is notorious for its swamps, and these are crisscrossed by sluggish and slow waterways known as bayous. One of the biggest is a tributary of the Mobile River, and it's called Big Bayou Cannot.
About a century ago, this slow, sleepy backwater found itself in the path of a new railroad that ran coast to coast across the US. The first Bayou Cannot rail crossing was 2 truss bridge spans stretching over 90 meters bank to bank. But in 1909, as the waterways got busier, the railroad replaced one of the trusses with a 42-meter steel plate girder span. The new span was anchored to 2 of the 3 piers beneath it, but intentionally left unattached at one end. The thinking was that if the bayou was ever needed for water traffic, the bridge could rotate or swing a full 90 degrees to allow barges and ships to pass.
So although the entire track was welded together, the end span was not bolted in place.
That might sound unusual, but it was basically future-proofing the bridge to allow river traffic to use the bayou further down the line.
But those plans were put on hold, as structural engineer Farhad Ansari explains.
The bridge was made like a swing bridge to begin with. However, the motorized part was not installed. It was basically railway tracks and girders connected to a truss part of the structure.
Although it wasn't considered at the time, leaving the end span unsecured made the bridge vulnerable to impact damage. The bayou ultimately remained closed to water traffic, and the unusual setup was eventually forgotten. On September 22nd, 1993, the towboat Movilla was heading up the Mobile River in dense fog, pushing 6 60-meter barges. Captain Ted Morley's simulator is set to the precise weather conditions of that night.
The evening of the accident, it was dark, it was foggy, so there was absolutely zero visibility. Because of the bayous being very swampy, you can have great visibility one moment, and then you go down to a whiteout condition the next moment. It's very disorienting to operate in if you're not properly equipped for it.
Just after 2 in the morning, the boat missed a bend in the river, and although the crew was unaware, they were now heading down the Big Bayou Cannot.
Fog is a big problem. I know I've been out on fishing trips where it was so foggy that I became disoriented. I thought I knew where I was. When the fog finally lifted, I was at least a mile from where I thought I should be. I understand fully how the captain could have been disoriented and lost his way going up Mobile River.
Big Bayou Cannot is narrow, shallow, and pretty much impassable for boats, certainly large barges, so heading into it at night was never going to be intentional.
Meanwhile, the Sunset Limited passenger train, en route from Los Angeles to Miami, arrived in Mobile to pick up passengers for the next leg of its journey. When it departed, there were 202 passengers and 18 crew members on board. Lost in the fog, the Movilla had no idea it was heading straight for the rail crossing.
So on the radar screen, we can see the bridge itself, which he interpreted as another vessel that was operating on the river. He was sounding it, trying to call the other vessel, when in fact it was the bridge for the Amtrak train crossing Big Bayou Cannot.
At 2:45 a.m., the lead barge struck the bridge at the unsecured end of the steel girder span. Despite the massive collision, the rails were not completely destroyed.
The impact force was sufficient so that it created 3 feet of displacement. So it mangled the tracks. It didn't break them.
Unfortunately, he didn't hit it hard enough to actually sever the rail, so the signal that broadcasts to the train that the bridge is out didn't actually get activated.
The train was heading at near full speed towards this track that was bent out of line by more than 3 feet, so that's about a meter. But with every signal on green, the train driver had absolutely no way of knowing that anything was wrong.
To make matters worse, the crew of the Movilla had no idea what bridge the barge had struck.
He mentioned that he had struck a bridge on the Mobile River 4 miles to the north of his actual position.
8 minutes later, with no warning, the Sunset Limited hit the deformed tracks and derailed, destroying the damaged bridge. David Adcock was a bosun with the US Coast Guard when he was woken by a call.
Early morning, September 1993, the phone starts ringing. He said, "Get up, we have a train in the water." Pulling into the mouth of Bayou Canot, there was a barge almost blocking the entire mouth of the bayou. But as we came around that barge, it was unbelievable, the sight.
The first 7 cars had derailed, plunging into the bayou below.
The water was on fire, there was diesel pouring out of the engines. The lead engine, when it left the tracks, had just buried, I think, 40 feet in the mud. It makes you want to run away and not to see that. The tragedy, I'll never forget that.
At first light, journalist David Rayner arrived on the scene.
By then, the fog had lifted. When we got there, it was a horrific sight. There was still fire burning on one of the engines, and there was one car hanging off the edge of the bridge. I knew it was going to be a really, really bad situation. There was going to be a lot of people that were in those cars underneath the water, and there was no escape.
103 people were injured, while 42 passengers and 5 crew members lost their lives. And everyone demanded answers. An investigation was launched to establish exactly what had happened and whether this was just a tragic accident.
There's no doubt that the barge hitting the bridge triggered this disaster, but investigators also found that this structure was particularly vulnerable to vessel collision.
The bridge was low to the water with no lights, and the fact it was a swing bridge acting as a fixed bridge complicated things further. David Rayner explains.
The rails were welded instead of in pieces. What happened when the barge hit the bridge piling was it shifted and twisted the rail, and so when the train hit that twisted part, it derailed.
Had one of the rails snapped instead of bending, it would have broken the track circuit and the signals would have gone red. In theory, this should have given the train enough time to stop.
So there were a lot of contributing factors to this, the weather conditions, the design of the bridge, the lack of proper signaling, the total lack of familiarity with the area. He was totally disoriented. A lot of things came together and contributed to this accident.
As a result, the fatally damaged section of the bridge was replaced. In addition, the safety report recommended beacons, radar reflectors, and other devices to make future bridges more identifiable on radar, as well as other visibly identifiable markers on the crossing themselves. So hopefully nothing like this will ever happen again.
In the wake of such a major disaster, it was vitally important that engineers and emergency services learnt lessons from the tragedy.
This was the worst accident in Amtrak's history, and one that is sadly forever etched into the minds of those who were there.
You know, if you ever witness this, you will never forget. You will never forget the Sunset Limited disaster.
Major engineering catastrophes can often be traced back to a minor miscalculation in the early stages of a project. Get your maths wrong, and the disaster can run deep. like this literally groundbreaking subterranean blunder off the coast of Spain.
Spanish authorities quickly realized that this ambitious project could actually be very dangerous.
A grand plan that rocked the Mediterranean coast in all the wrong ways.
A project which was wrongly conceived and even worse developed.
On paper, it seemed like a great idea, but it hit the headlines for all the wrong reasons.
And then you have your earthquakes.
Spain has a rich mix of history, culture, and natural beauty, including its stunning Mediterranean coast. But some things are in short supply.
Spain has very little natural gas of its own. In fact, 99.9% of the gas it uses is imported, either by pipeline from North Africa or arriving in ships.
To avoid a shortfall, engineers came up with a truly ambitious solution.
Hola, buen día. Buen día.
Called the Castor Project. Journalist Jordi Marçal covered the story.
The initial idea of the Castor project was to take advantage of a dried oil well here in the Mediterranean and to store gas underneath the sea.
And it just so happens the Spanish had found the perfect place to put this bold plan into action.
Off the coast of Spain, between Barcelona and Valencia, there is a massive old oil reservoir under the seabed. The oil was extracted back in the 1970s, but some clever engineers came up with the radical idea of reusing the cavity left behind, giving Spain a gas backup plan.
The scheme was highly ambitious, as petroleum geologist Dr. Josep Guiner explains.
The Castor wells were drilled to inject the gas and use the oil field as an underground gas storage. The idea was to inject gas, stored for a period of time, and then sell the gas when there was a peak of demand.
The plan was to run a pipeline from the mainland, nearly 30 kilometers along the ocean floor to the abandoned rig, before storing the natural gas in the old reservoir under the seabed.
By pumping gas down into this natural storage chamber, Spain could have a reserve of natural gas of about 286 billion gallons, or 130 billion cubic meters. That could supply the country for 50 days.
While this might sound like an ingenious solution, it's not as simple as filling a gas cylinder for a backyard barbecue.
Gas is difficult to store safely. It escapes unless your container is perfectly sealed. So pumping it into an undersea reservoir with cracks and crevices everywhere sounds risky.
In 2012, a massive rig was positioned above the empty oil reservoir to regulate the flow of gas into or out of the subterranean cavity. But today, there's a 500-meter exclusion zone around the rig, for good reason.
We are now approaching to the Castor rig. We are being told by radio to not go further because it's a restricted area and we cannot get so close. When the company tried to just to make it function and inject gas down the earth, it was a total disaster.
On October the 1st, 2013, residents in southern Spain felt the earth move beneath their feet when a massive earthquake hit. Emilio Valls was at home in the town of Cases d'Alcanar when the full force of the quake struck.
Yo recuerdo personalmente que esto fue una madrugada que estaba durmiendo y en mi propia sentía que la casa temblaba. En esos años yo vivía solo y recuerdo que te va a caer encima porque te asustas evidentemente. Y el mismo gente me dijo que ya había llamado varias personas diciendo que les había pasado exactamente lo mismo, que había notado muchos, se sintieron los seísmos del Castor, ¿no?
Within the space of a week after the initial quake, 15 smaller earthquakes were detected, followed by hundreds of tremors.
The quakes were picked up by Estefania Blanch and her team at the Ebro Observatory nearly 20 kilometers inland.
Este mapa, estas estaciones, esos triángulos, son las estaciones sísmicas que tenemos instaladas en diferentes puntos del entorno del proyecto Castor. El 1 de octubre de 2013, y lo que vemos fue por la noche, y aquí nos marca una magnitud de 3,9. Después de un cálculo que se hizo más profundo, se vio que este terremoto llegó a 13. Lo que observamos fue que en 2 meses, durante septiembre y octubre, hubo unos 1000 terremotos.
These were the first quakes of this magnitude to ever hit the region, and the finger was immediately pointed out to sea. Gas injections were halted and the project put on hold, while experts determined exactly what had caused the tremors. Dr. Josep Guiner believes there was a fundamental error on a critical calculation.
Well, a project like this basically depends on a single critical factor. And this factor is about pressure. You have 2 pressures. One is the pressure of the reservoir, and the other is the fracture pressure of the seal.
In normal operations, the gas would put pressure on the reservoir walls from the inside, particularly the rock cap at the top, known as the seal. If the pressure gets too high, it will literally break the rock of that seal, allowing gas to escape. That's the fracture pressure.
If this margin is very small, the volumes of gas that you're going to be able to inject are very limited.
Initial calculations estimated that the margin between the 2 figures was a safe and sufficient 20%. But Dr. Guiner believes the maths was flawed.
If you use the same data that the operating company used in this area, you reach a very different conclusion. They established that the fracture pressure of the seal was around 212 bars. And in my opinion, using their same data, my calculation gives you a maximum of 185 bar. The original pressure of the reservoir is 178 bar. So it gives you a very little margin if you accept that the 185 bar is the pressure at which the seal breaks.
The pressure of the gas building up inside the reservoir was too close to the fracture pressure of the rock seal. It caused disturbance in the ocean floor, allowing the gas to escape.
Busting the seal on the reservoir alone doesn't explain the earthquakes. However, for geologists, that was no mystery. The high point on the reservoir where the gas was breaking through was right next to the Amposta fault line.
As the escaping gas shook the seabed, this in turn triggered the Amposta fault line, causing the quakes on the mainland.
What happens is very simple. I mean, it's nothing, this is not rocket science. What happens is that you inject the gas, you exceed the fracture pressure of the seal breaks, the gas escapes, the gas goes into the fault moves, and then you have your earthquake.
With the pressure required to store gas so close to the reservoir's natural limit, engineers had only one choice.
A study conducted by engineers declared that any further use of the old reservoir to store gas would most likely result in dangerous seismic activity or more earthquakes.
The only solution here was to shut the Castor station down completely.
Since the gas stopped flowing in 2013, no major earthquakes have been detected. The hope is that the region will go back to its normal stability, and Spain's hunt for a natural gas backup source will continue.
The Spanish government will have to find new and innovative ways to fulfill the energy needs of its population that don't involve the potential for disaster.